This is the kind of video I don't think any other channel does without a script or without extensive editing, but I'm going to try to do this freestyle. The moral of the story, hashtag spoilers, is that peer review is not what people think it is. I got my best girl here, Melissa, off camera. So I'm talking to her in as much as I'm talking to the camera to keep this spontaneous, keep this off script, keep this. Let's keep this train in a constant state of derailment. Okay. There's a hilarious example. I'm going to edit in a clip of this here of a study that was published in multiple respected peer-reviewed journals that took the completely science fiction concept of having magical superpowers in the Star Wars movies and published it as peer-reviewed science.
In 2017, a paper was written about midichlorians, a made-up microscopic life form from the Star Wars franchise. The paper was a mashup of a Wikipedia article on the mitochondria with Star Wars fiction, even including the monologue about Darth Plagueis the Wise from Revenge of the Sith. This article was published by 4 journals: the American Journal of Medical and Biological Research, the International Journal of Molecular Biology Open Access, the Austin Journal of Pharmacology and Therapeutics, and the American Research Journal of Biosciences. Would anyone use this as proof that molecular biology is a fraud? That biologists are corrupt?
Yeah, so they used like the technical made-up terms that are in the Star Wars movies for how people, in the movies they get these magical superpowers. There's some jargon for that in their science fiction universe. Now, I think this was, of course, partly to prove the extent to which academic peer review is flawed, even in the hard sciences. But I think this example was chosen because any one of those key terms, if a person doing the peer review just thought, oh, I don't really know what that term means, and Googled it, a Google search would immediately direct them to like a Star Wars fan page, right? So this is like the worst way to kind of lampoon, the system. But my point in this video is not that peer review is a good system and that the system is broken, but that people fundamentally misunderstand what peer review is. So whether it's good or bad, I think by the end of this video you'll have a sense. It's not what you think it is. Now, all right, so Melissa, you probably grew up with some praise of the scientific method. This is a real difference in people's upbringings in the school system.
Oh yeah.
Like, so did you learn the scientific method as like the guiding light of Western civilization? Okay.
Definitely.
Well, I really didn't get the message. So what? Like, okay, off the top of your head, what is the scientific method? Why does it matter? Was this? Well, what was the ideology, or what was the ideal of the scientific method that you grew up with?
To come to a conclusion, you have to make an experiment. And in this experiment, you have to propose a hypothesis and test the hypothesis.
She has a sharp memory. Go on. Yeah.
You have to come up with an experiment to test the hypothesis. Right. And you have to kind of control for different variables and make sure that there aren't corrupting factors from one end or another, and do this test. And ultimately, you should do it multiple times to get different results, and do it with different variables.
And like for you, in terms of like romanticizing this for kids or giving it life in the classroom, were you given examples like? I'm thinking of examples I learned much later in life. There was a famous example of a scientist in England who discovered that cholera was being spread by a public well or something. Well, or maybe it was just Isaac Newton and the apple and the discovery of gravity or something. I mean, was there something given to you to say, like, hey, this was the difference between the Dark Ages when people, people didn't know to wash their hands with soap and water, and the emergence? Were you given some kind of set of examples, or does nothing stick in your memory?
I'm sure I was given examples. Yeah. Right now, they aren't coming to mind, but, you just mentioned soap.
Right.
Using soap. I remember learning about that.
So for my generation, this stuff was different because partly because I had a terrible education in Canada, but partly because the dark cloud of the atom bomb was really hanging over Western culture. And when you grow up, that had really dissipated. Like, what is science and what is the scientific method? the atom bomb and even the Holocaust itself, because the Holocaust, it wasn't just mass murder. It was technologically sophisticated factory production, applied to mass murder. And gas chambers. This was a new technology. I just say the image of the progress of science and technology. And also, just keeping it all the way real, the link between Nazi experiments and vivisection in our own culture and the push at that time to try to end testing of cosmetics on rabbits. Those things added up. This is long before I'd heard of veganism or became vegan. That added up to give science a really menacing quality. So I think that really, for my generation, I was at the end of that period of time, because after about 1989, 1991, all that stuff about the atom bomb starts to disappear. And indeed, the memory of the Holocaust and World War II is increasingly kind of put in a locker. Yeah. It's not because for me, my grandparents were still alive. That generation was still around. So the ideology of scientific progress, I think, starts to change with the end of the Cold War.
Yeah.
But
I guess that wasn't influencing my opinion on science.
Right.
But
you grew up with more of a straightforward, positive view of scientific method and
even when I was a kid,
progress in civilization.
It was a project when I would believe I was in elementary school where we actually went to the roof of my school, and we dropped eggs that were encapsulated in various contraptions to see if the egg would crack or not.
Right.
And what was more effective, like what padding was more effective than others.
This is like reenacting Galileo's experiments with an orange and stuff.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. And science, chemistry experiments too. Right. There are some experiments.
Well, I think this is part of the very definition of modernity is the idea that civilization is scientific progress, as opposed to the idea that civilization is tradition, which may well include religion. That tradition, legends, common fables. That the fabric of folkways. That's a bit of a technical term, but still, it's complete. If you've never heard the term folkways, you nevertheless know exactly what it means. That it's not folk culture, folklore, or tradition, but it's scientific progress. Is the very stuff of civilization itself. And as I say, for my generation, that took a hit. I think this is the illusion that people project onto peer review. So, what is the difference between people dying of cholera and people having, modern hygiene? Now, again, I think what we're actually taught in school is that the difference is the scientific method, that we discovered the necessity of sewage treatment and that we had to reorganize our cities and stop drinking river water that had our own poo in it. Sorry, it wasn't huge for civilization. We learned the hard way. I don't know if you know, that's another famous example. Doctors would handle sick people and corpses.
Yes, and then babies.
Right. And they would transmit the disease. Yeah. That's even during the early life of Sigmund Freud. Those basic concepts about transmission of disease were still not properly understood. Sorry, I read a biography of Sigmund Freud that dealt with some of that stuff. In Vienna, what were then the breaking discoveries when he was coming up as a student and changing attitudes towards medical science and progress. But that's not what peer review is. That's not what peer review is at all. Neither in its function nor in its dysfunction. So to say, unlike this funny example of the Star Wars pseudoscience getting in. There's another example I can put up, where an author, a scientist, I suppose, as a joke, wrote a hilariously awful article, which was kind of a lampoon on postmodern jargon, and managed to get that published, even though it was completely meaningless and this kind of thing. Whether it's in the pure sciences or the social sciences, I'm not here so much concerned with the dysfunction, the real function and limits of peer review. So my perspective on this is partly as someone who cares passionately about politics. And this comes up even when you discuss something like Wikipedia. How can you possibly expect Wikipedia to have politically neutral information or for their editorial process to work? No, I'm not saying Wikipedia is the worst. Probably Wikipedia is better than most newspapers in terms of giving you a somewhat balanced variety of sources. But whenever you get into anything that's really politically dicey, and whenever you get to a Wikipedia article and has a little lock symbol in the corner, there are people who passionately care about this issue. There are people who are willing to tell lies, people who are willing to back up their lies, and they may well have sources in print. So, I mean, most extreme and easy case is something like Holocaust denial. They have sources they can cite. Of course, those sources are dishonest and bad and wrong. But, I mean, you could have an endless series of revision wars, of editorial struggles at Wikipedia for how you're going to write, the history of the Holocaust. So how can Wikipedia work? Now, by the same token, so I've been involved in politics basically all my life. I had a period of about 10 years where I was a scholar of Buddhism. Now, in case you're new to the channel, I was a very edgy, I was a scholar of Buddhism who was interested in social and political problems. So I didn't turn off my brain within Buddhism. I was genuinely interested in, for example, the history of slavery, the plight of the poor, and all kinds of political and economic issues, past and present. But I was, nevertheless, a canonical Theravada Buddhist scholar. How do you expect a peer review committee in Japan that may be primarily staffed by Buddhist monks to have what does peer review mean when the people reviewing your paper are Japanese Buddhist monks in a conservative Buddhist university, or even they may literally be located in a monastery where they have this meeting, right? If that's a little bit too exotic for you, you can change it to a group of Catholic priests, and you present them with an essay. You're like, hey, I wrote an essay about the history of slavery and how the Catholic Church was involved in it and all the terrible things you guys did and how the priests were involved and they would torture people and the priests would interrogate them. Yeah, I did all this historical research about how terrible you guys were. Now, look, I have not been involved in journals of Catholic studies. I think there probably are some journals of Catholic studies where the editors, even though they're true believing Catholics, may really be people of merit and integrity and may say, hey, this is an important part of our history to publish about. I gotta tell you something. It's not my experience with Buddhism. It's not, right? It's really not. And not to get too deep into this, but I made an earlier video of myself talking to a current professor of Buddhist studies, where I was still proposing that I go back and get a PhD in Buddhism. That door is still open to me. I really do have enough background to very easily get a PhD in that field, which would change my whole life from this point out, if I deign to do so. And one of the points at which he suddenly got very defensive was where I simply talked about bias within the field. And I backed that up. I don't mean racism necessarily in a conventional lowbrow sense. And what I said to him then, also, even though it was spur of the moment, I said, I think quite convincingly and quite clearly, I said, if you're talking to someone who's devoted their life to Japanese Buddhism, what is their attitude towards a paper about Sri Lankan Buddhism or Buddhism in Cambodia? I mean, the geographic and linguistic divisions here. Tibet is unimaginably far away, both in language and culture and history and politics. It's a whole different set of questions from Sri Lanka and Thailand. Okay, so but those are exactly the forms of editorial bias. But my point here is peer review doesn't work either way. Peer review doesn't work if I'm a specialist within Tibetan Buddhism and all the reviewers are pious, true-believing Tibetan monks. And it doesn't work if it's someone from Tibet submitting their paper to a group of reviewers who are all Japanese Buddhist monks. It utterly breaks down and breaks apart. Sorry, it's not even that it breaks. This is how it works. This is what peer review really is. It's a conclave of true believers giving their imprimatur to studies that agree with their latent biases and their political and ideological agendas. So this has come up in debates about global warming and anti-global warming. So you got 10 academics with PhDs who do peer review for a publication. They may be sincerely, okay, let's just say we started a publication. We had 10 professors who were all specifically passionate about endangered species conservation. Okay, that's really their background. And then over time, because global warming is the big issue, they start peer reviewing papers on global warming. They probably don't have the same way the Japanese scholar, what expertise is he going to have relevant to my paper about slavery? Probably none. Even though it's a subtle shift, this guy's an expert in endangered species conservation. All he sees is, well, this is a study with a lot of complex math in it, and it's supporting a global warming hypothesis. Again, he is not paid to take the time and go through those numbers in detail. Believe me, if I write a paper for Buddhism and I'm quoting the original Pali, I'm dealing with complex linguistic and nobody. No, I'm going to come back to this. This is also part of the reality of peer review versus editing. Peer review is not editing. It's not the same thing. In terms of making an in-depth edit and evaluation and going through and checking your math or checking your argument, no, that's not going to happen. Whether you have 10 scholars who are sincere about wanting to ring the alarm bells on global warming, they're going to sit there and say, oh, okay, good. Like, this is on our side. Seems to me the data looks like data. Not going to evaluate it. Rubber stamp, imprimatur. It gets published. And then the opposite is what you also see. There's going to be some publication, and they have managed to get 10 scientists who are against global warming, and they're rubber stamping publications that come the other way. And within Buddhism, I think that the saddest and sickest example of this, which I've dealt with in several videos on this channel, is the science, the complete bullshit masquerading as real science of publishing peer-reviewed scientific papers about meditation. And this stuff is just as fake as in the old days when Christians used to publish peer-reviewed studies trying to prove that prayer was effective. That prayer was effective in healing people who were in a coma, or that prayer had some impact on a plant that was published in all the newspapers. They did a study where, like, they had one set of potted plants over here that nobody prayed to, and they had another set where they had true believing Christians come in and pray to the plant and see which plants grew better. It's like... I remember laughing with a friend of mine. I was like, even if this is true, like, why do you worship this God that you think makes a 5% difference in how rapidly, a daisy grows out of a pot or something? Wow. So, that kind of junk science has always been around. And this is not peer review failing to work. This is how peer review actually works. So one of my perspectives on this is because I used to work as a professional editor of academic nonfiction. And I was offered that job again in Taiwan. My whole life would be different if I'd taken it. And I had authors from all over the world, mostly white Europeans, but also some Asians. I had quite a number of Japanese authors, maybe one from Thailand, one from Indonesia. But they were mostly white Westerners. But even then, you saw a really deep culture. Like the difference between a German academic and a French academic and an American academic, it's remarkable. And I deal with all these people at PhDs. They'd be sending me their manuscripts or their book chapters, and I'd be making the book. But I'd be going through and really editing. And one of the things I have to get across to them is, no. Editing is not peer review. They were used to peer review, which is what I described before, right? And the peer reviewer isn't paid a salary. And the peer reviewer doesn't correct grammatical error. I mean, they may, if they go through it in detail. A peer reviewer is not going through, and like this is the type of error I would catch all the time. You have the date 1763 in your essay, and I just take the time to look it up. Oh, no. You meant 1673. All the time, those errors are in there. I'm an editor, I'm not a peer reviewer. I stop and I challenge you. Okay, well, you said this about the government policy at this time, but in this section of the essay, you said this instead. That's editing. And the editor's role has withered up and died because basically the publishing industry no longer has the money for it and nobody's willing to pay for it. And you have to pay an erudite, hardworking person with attention to detail to do it. Sorry, and I just want to make this clear. Editing is also not copy editing, right? Copy editing is a separate word that's sometimes referred to as sub-editing. Copy editing is where you just check for spelling errors and commas in the wrong place and formatting errors and hyphens, this kind of stuff. Real editing, real editorial is where you actually challenge the author. Say, okay, you said this here. There's no footnote. How do you know that? How do you back it up? I remember one guy got furious with me because I just pointed out that he presented. I said, look, you present an interesting argument here, but you don't have any footnotes or context explaining it. I don't know to what extent this is your original work, or if this is something that's appeared in 5 other books before. I need to. He was furious. He calmed down. He calmed down eventually, but we had several emails back and forth trying to iron this out. I was like, look, if we're going to publish this, you can't claim to be inventing the wheel with research that's not really your research and this sort of thing. So this is another misconceptions. Now, one of the things people said about me back when I was a scholar of Buddhism, I'd never seen this word before. They said, "Oh, that Eisel Mazard, he's an originist." He analyzes things by looking at their origins, it was interesting comment about me. Okay, what is the origin of peer review? I have brought this up with many, many professors. I had a very brief story about it on my old blog. And every single time, professors were astounded to learn this. Okay, peer review originated in the United Kingdom. I would just say England, Scotland, and Wales. But it really especially has to do with Scotland. This came up a lot when we were living in China. I was explaining to my students that the real turning point in the history of education in Europe actually took place in Scotland, not England. And then England caught up, several generations later. But Scotland started having these learned societies in places like Edinburgh and Glasgow. They were making remarkable scientific progress and discoveries, also the medical school in Edinburgh and so on. But of course also in other fields, even like sociology, stuff that's more social sciences or what have you. They were doing and publishing a lot of original research. And up to that point, they had ye olde censor's office. In England, there still is the office of the censor. There is still one man in England who has the title censor. It's an official government post there. It's not just, we just complain about censorship as an abstract concept. That's actually a job still today in the government of England to be the censor. He's one man. And this one man, I assume has a few secretaries and assistants, what have you, could not oversee these scientific publications. And a couple centuries earlier, in the Dark Ages, you could. And that was a job. So this is also linked to the split between Protestantism and Catholicism in Europe. Because before, when England was Catholic, before Henry VIII and split away, that job was really handled by Rome. And for many parts of Europe, it continued to be. So when Copernicus it's really in one publication from Copernicus, but he wrote this one important work, and he published it only in Latin, not in any vernacular, which I think he knew that was to avoid censorship. It was handed over. Ultimately, it was the Vatican. It was the Catholic authorities in Rome who would decide whether or not to suppress it. And an historian went in and did the detailed analysis. It would have been censored, but apparently the reviewer who mattered, the viewer who was ringing alarm bells, because you had to read the Latin carefully. It was a lot of math. It had to do with observations of the movements of the stars and planets. And explaining this thesis, you had to be really good at both Latin and math to figure out how subversive this work from Copernicus was. But the one guy who figured it out in Rome, he died. He died of natural causes at the right time, so the book wasn't censored. So I just say that the censor's role, one, Protestantism cuts you off from the Catholic tradition of censorship. And again, that battle then gets fought generations later by Galileo. Galileo is the martyr for modern science in that way, in his own peculiar historical character, right? So in England, this becomes England's own responsibility, and Scotland's own responsibility. And they don't want to do it. So they set up a system of decentralized censorship. And that is the origin of peer review. The role of the peer reviewer at its inception and still today was simply to review the work and rubber stamp it that there was nothing objectionable to the government. It was developed very literally as taking the role of censorship and farming it out to established scholars. You'd say, okay, well, you're a member of the establishment. You're already a professor or something. You're some kind of respectable scientist. You know the kind of thing the government wouldn't allow to be published, or that we'd ask to be deleted or rewarded or something. So 2 of you or 3 of you go through a process where you guys read it and you okay it. And if you okay it, it'll go ahead. And of course, implicitly, if something offensive to the government was published, you know whose head who could be held responsible for this, okay? So peer review, in terms of its origins, was created as a system of censorship. It's not created as a system of scientific fact-checking. Fact-checking is part of the editor's role, and fact-checking is very time-consuming. And today, nobody wants to pay for it. And that's what you see in terms of the decline in the quality of journalism and everything else. But just imagine, I used to do this for a living, but if I'm handed something and it makes a bunch of complex claims about what was going on in the government of Vietnam in 1984, it's very hard for me to sit there and say, okay, is this person accurately reporting? Because I'm peer reviewing an article about. I'm not peer reviewing. I'm editing an article about what was going on in Cambodian politics, and it briefly mentions a bunch of stuff about what was going on in Vietnamese politics, which is of course linked. I start checking into it, and I'm like, look, this doesn't add up. Where did you get this from? You got this from Breitbart news agency. You got this from the Vietnamese equivalent of Breitbart or something. This doesn't match up with the basic facts. But here's the difference with real editing, right? Real editing is also a dialogue and a discourse. Peer review has none of that. Peer review is either it's approved or it's rejected. period. And that's because it developed as a system of censorship. What you really need is exactly to say, look, and you can be polite, but say, look, I like your article. There's some good things about it, but you have this one paragraph about what was happening in Vietnam in the early 1980s, and this doesn't check out for me. I mean, so what are your sources here, or what are you thinking, or could you rewrite this? Because in terms of the basic facts, I don't see how this matches up with the rest of it. And they write back to you, and either they'll do it or they refuse. Either they can back it up or they can't. That is the process of fact checking and editing. It has to be back and forth with the author. That's utterly lacking, right? Now, sorry, the final. I mean, I could give many examples just from my own life about how peer review works. I have been a peer reviewer. I have no PhD. I have peer reviewed multiple articles, and I'm good at it. Partly because I have this background in editing, partly because I'm incredibly cynical about what peer review is and what it ought to be. I had a situation in Cambodia where I wrote an article. It's still on the internet. The article deals with racism, imperialism, mass murder. It's about, I was a scholar of Buddhism, but I dealt with real issues. And it deals with even the origin of Nazi ideology in Buddhist studies. So the connection between Buddhist research and Aryan race theory and racism in Western Europe, which is fascinating. So there's a lot of really politically hard-hitting stuff here coming out of Buddhist studies. And you ask yourself, why is it you don't see hard-hitting stuff like that coming out of academia or Buddhist studies or Buddhist publications? It's because peer review is a system of censorship, right? This article, okay. So this article, and it's especially relevant to Cambodia, and I was going to publish it in quite a humble publication that's based in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. Now, I thought it would go ahead for a number of reasons. That publication, the reviewers are not Buddhist monks. I don't think they're Buddhist, period. They're a bunch of old white men with PhDs from France. I would guess all of them are French, maybe one or two are Australian, but the peer reviewers are probably all conservative white French scholars based in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. So they get this essay, and the lead editor, the senior academic who's in charge, says right away, he reads it, he says, wow, this is brilliant, this is important, we're gonna publish it. Great. Months and months go past. I'm living in Cambodia this time. I'm busy with other things. And then I get back to them. And for me, the main reason to publish them was that everything they published in that publication, they published in both English and Cambodian. And I really wanted to reach the Cambodian. That's what I cared about, frankly, in a humanitarian way. I get back to him a couple months later and I say, okay, so what's happening with the translation? Because, I'm really, what I really care about is the human. And he says, well, it's complicated. And he says, if you want to speed up the process, you could pay a translator. You could start working with a translator, because I know, again, I'd have to talk. The translator would have questions. Okay, what do you mean in this passage? Because translating academic English into Cambodian is not easy. There'd be a lot of Q&A. So you can get started with a translator, and up to so much money, we'll pay you back. This kind of thing. So he said, because we have a budget for translation, but it's probably better if you want to speed it up. So that's how certain he was. He was gonna publish the thing. I start talking to translators. Months go past. And he breaks down and admits to me the reality of the situation. He kept presenting it to peer reviewers. They kept rejecting it for purely nationalistic reasons. My essay was insulting to the memory of the French Empire. This is the 21st century. This is in the 21st century. Right? When you think anti-imperialism and sort of left-wing white guilt or something, this, so again, I thought I had a secular, Western, non-religious, because I knew this would not get published by a Buddhist studies, conservative Buddhist studies. This was too insulting to the memory of what they thought of as the greatness of the French Empire in Cambodia and Vietnam, because France conquered Cambodia and Vietnam, etc. It worked out great. Have you heard of the Vietnam War? It's kind of like the appendix to that disaster, right? Okay, and so what he kept doing, he kept giving it to a scholar, and they'd reject it, and then he would crumple up the record that he'd given it to a peer reviewer, because it's supposed to be just give it to two peer reviewers, and if they both say no, it's rejected, right? And he would pretend he hadn't done that, and he would try with another scholar, and he tried with the whole college. So whatever. Again, most of these people, maybe they have 10 people with PhDs, maybe fewer, maybe 6 or something, right? And every single one of them rejected it out of pure political bias, not even religious bias, right? And this shows many things about the peer reviewers. Because this guy, the one doing the review, his name is Michel Antelme. He's at INALCO in France. He's a major scholar in his field. He's probably the number one scholar on Cambodia. He recognized the merit and importance of my article. So why can't he go ahead and publish it? Why, even if there are problems with it, why can't he start engaging with me as an editor? Because it's fine. He can challenge me the same way I've been describing an editor challenging someone. He could go through and say, okay, well, in this paragraph, where are you coming from? Or how do you back this up? Fine. I'm all for it. That's scrutiny. What the process needs is scrutiny. But peer review is not scrutiny. And again, even this joke example, it's a real example of the Star Wars science fiction bullshit being published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. It shows peer review is not a system of scrutiny. It's not a system of content-driven editorship. It's not a system of scrutiny. It is just a system of censorship. I've seen this again and again in my life. I saw it when I was doing work on social conditions in Cambodia. I saw complete fiction published in The Lancet. The Lancet. The Lancet is the single most revered peer-reviewed journal in medicine. And I was going through their stuff on Cambodia that was linked to the research I was doing, social science research. In Cambodia, my research involved AIDS and a lot of other social problems in the medical care system. And I was finding stuff, just like the article about Star Wars, things that I could prove were false just by taking them and Googling them. We think, oh, that doesn't sound right. Let me Google it. Let me check these couple of reports of MS. And it's wrong. Because nobody's doing that. Sorry. So guys, that's my conclusion here. Peer review is not a system of scrutiny. It's a system of censorship. It's not the scientific method. It's not even the Writers Guild method of how to revise a script. I know people believe in peer review as the difference between light and darkness, between what's legitimate and what's illegitimate. What I'm inviting you to imagine here is that Buddhist studies is not so unique. The important research, the important message, the important findings I had to share in Buddhist studies were impossible to publish in Buddhist studies today in the 21st century. And it's worth noting that field was way more open to new ideas, new discoveries in the 19th century. This is true even about First Nation studies. I'm sorry, it's one more example, but each one of these examples is really important to me. So, Buddhist studies in the 19th century, soldiers with no PhD and no formal education who were deployed in the British Empire would dabble in archaeology and research on Buddhism, and they would send in as letters to what are now peer-reviewed journals, to academic journals, their findings, and they found brilliant and important stuff. And I think one reason for that was that a lot of the soldiers had good translators. They probably had the best translators in the British Empire. So they'd be going out and they'd be looking at ruins, and they'd be saying, well, some of the villagers say this ruin used to be this, but we excavated and we found that, or we talked to some Buddhist monks over here, and they told us this and that. You had incredibly valuable findings being published, again, without peer review, sent in as handwritten letters from soldiers on the outermost parts of the British Empire. But it was really important, vital stuff that was getting published. There was a hypothesis. I mentioned this to my girlfriend recently. We were talking about Korean and Ojibwe. We still look at the possibility of studying First Nations languages here in this apartment, in this relationship. We're talking about whether or not we could go back and study Cree, Ojibwe, Algonquian languages, that languages indigenous to Canada. There was this hypothesis that was published many, many decades ago. I'm sorry, I think it was the 1970s. And today it wouldn't be published because it was just a hypothesis. It was a hypothesis in the purest sense of the word. This guy looked at the linguistic data for all the native peoples in North America and South America, the whole mega continent, North and South America, and the Caribbean. And he drew lines on a map, and he said, hey, look, I don't really have any evidence, but based on comparative study of these languages, this is my theory of how the actual migration took place when these people first settled North and South America. All right? 40 years later or something, DNA research, bang, confirms that his hypothesis was right on. It's such an important article, but it was just a hypothesis. It was just speculation. And that's exactly what peer review excludes. Now, again, all the problems you have with Wikipedia are infinitely worse with peer review. They're worse both positively and negatively. They're worse in terms of what they will publish. They're worse in terms of what they exclude. They're worse because they utterly lack the back and forth of challenging the person. Say, well, do you have a source on this? Can you improve this? Can you rewrite this? It's a single stage process. And exactly the areas where Wikipedia is impossible to trust, like politics, like religion. But some of these examples I'm giving are hard sciences even. Linguistics, physics and chemistry and what have you. In exactly those same areas where Wikipedia is unreliable, peer review itself is worse than useless. Guys, if you watched this video, thank you for spending the time with me. Any last thoughts, babe? What is civilization? Is civilization the aggregate sum of our traditions, our cultural assumptions, our beliefs, our folklore and our national characteristics, or is it scientific progress? Well, one of the fundamental problems of scientific progress is that it is elite, it is elitist, it's something the vast majority of us can't participate in any meaningful way. And peer review, I think, is another example of one of these aspects of academia, whether it's in the sciences or the arts or what have you, anything to do with academia, where it's remained behind the curtain. It's remained behind a veil of inscrutability. It's been glorified and glamorized in many people's minds just because it's just slightly out of sight. And I think that will change for one reason. And that one reason is what's now called sousveillance. So sousveillance is the opposite of surveillance. When I first went to Cambridge University, England, they were just experimenting with taking professors' lectures and dumping them on YouTube, basically dumping them on the internet. And one of them was a famous left-wing professor giving a lecture on Marxism. He'd probably given the same lecture for 20 years. And, it sounds impressive. Oh, this great professor, he has a PhD, he has peer-reviewed articles, and, lecturing at this incredibly elite, incredibly expensive, incredibly hard to get into university. And the lectures were garbage. Sousveillance changes everything. There's a Facebook project called Film Your Marxist Professors. So far, it's garbage. They're not doing anything. But the concept of that is very powerful. We all know, if you've been to university, you know what it's like to be in the classroom with a professor who's saying something so crazy and so stupid or so ill-informed and so ignorant that you can't believe it's being said in the classroom, and you're powerless to challenge it because there's an absolute unequal relationship of authority. Well, now, as never before, you can film that, and you can put it on YouTube. And this will challenge academia in a way that it has never been challenged before. The power of sousveillance, the power of Film Your Marxist Professors, to shake academics out of, because most of those professors who are saying crazy, dumb things, it's because for the last 20 years they dug down into a narrower and narrower little trench. They're just within radical left-wing women's studies. Or indeed, the Buddhist professors, they're within this little narrow trench where nobody challenges how insane their ideas about Buddhism are. Not even other Buddhists. They don't even hear it from mainstream Buddhism or something. They're working within this. Within politics, but even within the sciences. There are lots. When you talk to people in the STEM fields, there are a lot of horror stories about awful professors in science. I think what is ultimately going to change peer review and academia itself is the camera, the miniature camera, the culture of the internet, YouTube. I think sousveillance is going to mark a line in the sand between the past and the future of what we do in higher learning. And then and only then will freedom of speech come to academia, and maybe we can see a fundamental reform in the way peer review and the progress of human knowledge and inquiry works.